This is life. We all know that this life doesn't last forever, but we are often told that there is nothing beyond this temporal life. What if there is? Consider that the choices you make in this life have a lasting impact in what comes next. What if life has a purpose? Perhaps you do not believe in God, but say that He does exist. What harm could it possibly do to ponder His existence and consequently find a fulfillment to your life that you could otherwise have been without? If you have believed in Him and He does exist, you lose nothing. God asks for your heart and in exchange grants eternal happiness. And if that is the wager, then it is worth making.
Since many people today claim that science makes the idea of God redundant, our first step will be to show you that good science and faith in God are entirely compatible. When it comes to understanding the origin and cause of things, instead of contradicting God's existence, the most reasonable conclusion based on our scientific knowledge is that life was created and sustained by God. In the world as we see it, scientists have established some absolute facts or laws. Such laws include the law of conservation of energy and the law of conservation of matter. Together, these laws state that energy or matter cannot be created or destroyed. In other words, the net quantity of matter and energy is constant. It is most logical, however, to conclude that matter and energy must have been caused by something, since something cannot come from nothing. The question then is what or who transcended the existence of matter and energy to cause their existence. According to most physicists, the idea that the universe came into existence suddenly at a certain time in the distant past seems more likely than not. This theory, known as the Big Bang theory, is not opposed to Christian belief and was, in fact, originally proposed by a Catholic priest, Monsignor Georges Lemaitre, in the 1920s. The claim is that the universe began with an explosion, beginning from a tiny point of infinite density. This explosion eventually gave rise to the galaxies, stars, planets, and all life. The key point of debate over this theory is the question of what or who was behind the incident. From the beginning, the universe has been full of motion, but who produced all this motion? When we see a chain of dominoes falling, we know that someone must have knocked the first domino. The same is true of our universe. We see motion, and we know that there must have been someone or something outside the universe that brought it into motion. Have you ever known a bang or an explosion to create anything other than chaos and destruction? In the case of the world, we instead see immense harmony and order. It therefore appears that the Big Bang was guided rather than a chaotic occurrence. Who or what guided it? The Church has always believed that the world came about by an initial act of creation. The Big Bang is a good example of what an act of creation could look like. There are good reasons to think that the universe did indeed have a definite beginning. A German physicist, Rudolf Clausius, is considered the originator for the concept of entropy. This concept indicates that much of the order around us is slowly descending into disorder or chaos. It is so convincing that a scientific law has been established to describe it. The second law of thermodynamics notes that entropy or disorder increases over time. This not alone indicates that the universe is unwinding into chaos, but if it is winding down, at some point in time it must have been fully wound up and more orderly. The universe cannot therefore be infinitely old. It had an orderly beginning. The question is, who or what was able to work outside the known laws of thermodynamics to wind it up in the first place? Even before you consider how life started, the exact order of the world is clearly seen in nature. The interaction of planets and galaxies and all physical things is governed by fundamental scientific constants and quantities. These constants are fixed numbers that define the relationship between physical objects. They are the same everywhere in the universe. They include the gravitational constant and the speed of light. Each one of these constants is extremely fine-tuned and inherently immutable. Cosmologist and astrophysicist Martin Rees has said that wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. For example, the gravitational constant is an extremely precise number. If it were to differ by even a mere 1 in 10 to the power of 60 of a part, then none of us would exist. It is such a minuscule part size that it is difficult at best, if not impossible, to even imagine it. The fact that such a microscopic change in something as fundamental as gravity could alter our very existence only supports the notion that the universe has a specific order and could not logically have existed by chance. This is why the cosmologist Stephen Hawking has said that the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Who then did the fine-tuning? Fred Hoyle, a celebrated cosmologist, concluded that a common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintelligent has monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Hoyle is echoed by a contemporary physicist, Paul Davies. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. This design of nature, so beautifully orchestrated, is nothing short of intelligent. And where there is intelligent design, it is only logical to conclude that there is a designer. The origin of life has been a topic of dispute and discussion for as long as man has been able to contemplate it. Among the many theories concerning life's beginning is that of Charles Darwin. It must be emphasized, however, that Darwin does not actually address the origin or first beginning of life. His theory requires the pre-existence of one or more simple life forms that reproduce themselves. Supporters of Darwinism proposed that these life forms came about through the chance combining of molecules which spontaneously generated life. The discovery of DNA, however, knocked this theory on its head because it showed that even the very simplest imaginable life form was so vastly complex that it could not possibly have happened by chance. The eminent philosopher-scientist Antony Flew, after a lifetime as a committed intellectual atheist, was convinced by DNA that there must be a God. He wrote a book about it called There Is a God. Darwin's theory consists chiefly on the principle of natural selection, the preservation and accumulation of advantageous genetic qualities. While genetic variations can yield species of varying strengths, the life form that is strongest will prevail. Darwin says that these stronger characteristics will dominate the species and even gradually develop into the formation of new species. Darwin's theory has two problems. First, there is inadequate evidence to confirm this theory, and arguably the evidence that does exist would indicate it to be untrue. Secondly, many think Darwin's theory is a fact, when it remains a theory. Many consequently think that the theory of evolution definitively rules out the existence of God. This is a very concerning consequence if God really does exist. Ironically, even if Darwin's theory is true, it wouldn't contradict Christianity. From the perspective of Christianity, man may or may not have evolved from a lower species, but he became a person when he was given a spiritual soul. In other words, it doesn't matter whether man was instantly created or if he biologically evolved from a lower life form. Either way, his spiritual soul is what makes him a person, and this could only come from God. The scientific challenge with Darwin's theory is that it only supports microevolution. An animal born stronger than its sibling will probably thrive, whereas the sibling may not survive. This leads to more animals with stronger characteristics and a more resilient species. There is a significant absence of evidence for macroevolution. where one species can evolve into another species, or one life form can evolve into a different, more sophisticated and capable life form. To support Darwin's theory, one would expect to find evidence of half-breeds, that partial development of a new species from a previous species. Darwin himself, in The Origin of the Species, admitted that the greatest objection to his theory was this lack of intermediate fossils. His answer was that in time these fossils would be discovered, but this did not happen. Despite excavating millions of tons, scientists have not uncovered a definitive lineage that evidences a transition of one species to another. Although there is a lack of evidence for the transition of species, the fossil record does show that simple life forms existed before more complex life forms. Darwin's theory does not provide a scientifically satisfactory mechanism for evolution, so genuine science continues to seek a mechanism. But so far, a satisfactory mechanism has not been found. In biblical terms, the book of Genesis notes that creation of the world was implemented in stages, with plant life before animal life, and then eventually human life. This aligns well with the fossil record. Darwin's theory also meets with resistance from the second law of thermodynamics, for which entropy works against the development of order, or more complex entities. The law of increasing entropy is a universal law of decreasing complexity, whereas evolution is proposed as a universal law of increasing complexity. This appears to pose a contradiction. Can Darwin's case for increasing complexity and entropy's decreasing complexity both be correct when the known laws of the universe are otherwise not found to contradict each other? To further add to the pile of counter-evolutionary evidence, Darwin's theory also presupposed that life is formed from simple blobs of material that have a natural selection trail of development into more sophisticated components. He was very explicit that this assumption was fundamental to his theory, as he wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly be formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." The subsequent invention of the electron microscope allows us to see what the building blocks of life forms really consist of. Instead of a trail consisting of merely randomly arranged blobs of material, one sees a highly sophisticated assembly line. Professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, Michael Behe, reasonably argues that this sophisticated assembly line could not possibly have been formed by random selection and time. Although many have sought to discredit Professor Behe's findings, the counter-arguments merely consist of hypothetical ideas rather than actual evidence to the contrary. The formation of complex structures and machines by random selection presupposes that each successive random variation produced some advantage to its form that merited its continued existence compared to a variation that did not produce such a benefit. The multitude of beneficial random selections would also need to be lined up in careful sequence, otherwise the required machine part would not work. This is at variance with Darwin's idea of random selection and survival of the fittest, because random selection would not have sustained a partially built machine that had no functional capability during the many phases of its assembly process. Furthermore, there is no convincing evidence that shows the existence of complex part-made components, or components randomly in the making towards known functional components. In other words, the electron microscope shows fully developed, highly complex molecular machines for which the origin of these simplest building blocks so far cannot be traced. This is a sufficient basis on which Darwin's theory would absolutely break down. In the absence of such an evolutionary trail, these intelligent machines instead appear to have been intelligently designed rather than formed by random selection. The creation of the world from nothing the fine-tuning of the universe, the origins of life, whether through a process of evolution or not, all reflect intelligent design. Evidence of intelligent design indicates evidence of a designer. Such design is beyond the capability of man. So who is the designer? Richard Dawkins, an atheist and emeritus fellow of New College, Oxford, was a former critic of intelligent design. He has since agreed that intelligent design is a plausible explanation for the origin of life. In the absence of sufficient evolutionary evidence for the origins of life on Earth, Emeritus Professor Dawkins proposes that life may instead have been seeded onto Earth by a more sophisticated alien life form. He further proposes that this alien itself must have come into existence through an explicable process such as evolution. This, however, leads to even more questions. On accepting the evidence for intelligent design, and therefore an intelligent designer, it appears one has a choice of owing our existence to aliens or to a supreme being that transcends this universe, by definition, God. So, when we look at the world around us, there are good reasons to believe that there is a God who created it all. But it's also worth looking inward at ourselves. What are we? Are we just bodies essentially equivalent to cats and mice and trees? Or is there something more to us? Consider our memory, for example. Other animals have simple memories, essentially trained instincts. But our memories are like vast underground caves that we can explore. The human memory contains an abundance of impressions and emotions, and none of these can be physically located. Certainly, some parts of the brain are linked with memory, but they are not identified with memory. We can point to a brain and we can hold it and measure it, but we cannot weigh memories or locate them physically. And yet our memory is an essential part of us. So there is something non-physical that somehow forms part of us. Something similar could be said about conscience, the part of our mind that makes judgments about right or wrong. Mere matter cannot make moral judgments. A rock or a flower or rabbit cannot determine whether an action is good or bad. And yet at times we can very clearly hear the voice of our conscience warning us against evil. Again, we have to say that even though material bodies are part of our being, there is something non-material that is just as essential. Soul is the term we use to indicate all these non-material aspects of the human person. Memory, free will, conscience, reasoning ability, and so on. And since the soul is non-physical, it doesn't decay or die. It is immortal. Every human being, as well as having unique DNA, also has a unique immortal soul. And this is what makes each human, at whatever stage of its development, something precious, endowed with dignity, to be protected and cherished. What does this have to do with the existence of God? Firstly, an immortal soul must have a cause or a source that is itself immaterial, so that the very essence of our souls is evidence of God's creative work. But there is another point to be made. This soul that we have is restless, full of desires, not easily satisfied. We try to satisfy our souls with various temporary pleasures, but the sense always remains that our soul needs something more and was made for something more. We can always say of our souls that it still hasn't found what it's looking for. As Shakespeare has Queen Cleopatra say, "I have immortal longings in me." These desires for the ultimate, absolute good that will at last satisfy, these immortal longings, are indications that our souls were made to rest not in any limited created good, but in the infinite goodness of God Himself. When we look within, we find the fingerprints of the Creator who made us with a dimension of our being that can only be complete and happy with Him. The great writer, Dorothy Sayers, in her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, claimed that Theology is the mistress science without which the whole educational structure will necessarily lack its final synthesis. In other words, the study of all fields of science and our own self-reflection makes sense only in light of God. In the absence of God, one's understanding remains incomplete at best. If God created the world, then it entirely makes sense that God and science are consistent and compatible with each other, since science is merely an investigation of the world created by God. Altogether, the most reasonable conclusion based on good science and wise self-reflection is that life was created by God and that life is sustained by God. Since it is entirely reasonable that you exist because God created you, might God have a purpose for your life? Might life be where we choose to love God or reject Him? If you think everyone goes to heaven anyway, then why would God bother to put us through this life first? More on this in part 2.